Well, meine Damen und Herren, ladies and gentlemen, my heart is filled with gratitude. This is one of the really, vielen Dank, one of the great honors of my life, and I mean that. I've been so warmly received here, and what I particularly appreciate is the level at which my work has been engaged by all the speakers. The session last night was wonderful, and of course my dear friend Stefan Oster so beautifully delved into the depth of my work. So please know how much I appreciate that you've spent the time to understand the work that I do. As I say, I consider this one of the really great honors of my life. So my gratitude goes out to all the organizers of the event and of the Josef Pieper Foundation. And a special word of thanks to mein Bruder, Stefan Oster. We first met at the Synod in 2018, the Synod on Young People. And I remember he came up to me with the characteristically big smile, and he said, some people call me the Robert Barron of Germany. But I can say now, and I mean this with great honesty, I'd be very honored to be called the Stefan Oster of America. Because I think he's one of the great leaders in the church in Germany, and may his tribe increase. Friends, I prepared a paper on Josef Pieper, and as a tribute to him and also a sign of my gratitude to you, I'm going to read the first, roughly 5 pages auf Deutsch. I want to apologize in advance for my halting German, but it really is meant, it was meant as a tribute to Josef Pieper and what he's meant to me. And then I'll read the rest of the paper in English, if that's okay. In Demut und mit großer Freude nehme ich den Josef Pieper Prize dankend an. Als Student und Seminarist war mir Pieper eine wichtige Inspirationsquelle und ein Wegweiser. Und ich freue mich, berichten zu können, dass Pieper, zumindest in meinem Land, weiterhin von ernsthaften jungen Katholikinnen und Seminaristen mit Begeisterung gelesen wird. Sie schätzen ebenso wie ich seine Ausgewogenheit, seine profunde Intelligenz, seine Hochachtung der katholischen intellektuellen Tradition und sein Bestehen darauf, dass Gebet, Denken und moralisches Handeln in einer gegenseitigen Bezogenheit stehen. Ich bin der Überzeugung, dass das Denken von Josef Pieper von besonderer Bedeutung für unsere Zeit ist, in der sich so viele Menschen im Westen von den Kirchen abwenden und in der ein ideologischer Säkularismus in so vielen Bereichen die Überhand gewinnt. Seine Betrachtungen über die Tugenden, eindringlich und anerkannt zugleich, sind für uns und auch seine Auseinandersetzung mit einer religiös-skeptischen Kultur von entscheidender Bedeutung. Aber noch wichtiger sind seine Betrachtungen zur Kontemplation, jenem intellektuellen Akt, der uns aber das Alltagsbewusstsein hinaushebt. Diese wertvolle und unverwechselbare Geisteshaltung möchte ich in diesem Vortrag betrachten. So, der philosophische Akt. Beginnen möchte ich mit einem harten Kontrast zwischen den Annahmen zweier britischer Philosophen, die 3 Jahrhunderte auseinander liegen. Die erste stammt von einem der Begründer der modernen Philosophie, Francis Bacon. Wissen selbst ist Macht. Genauer gesagt, Macht über die natürliche Welt, um das Leben der Menschen länger, angenehmer und sicherer zu machen. Mit diesem Wort greift Bacon natürlich seinem jüngeren Zeitgenossen René Descartes auf, deren bewusste Abkehr von Großteil der intellektuellen Tradition, die ihm vorausging, argumentierte, dass Philosophen die Kontemplation hinter sich lassen und danach streben sollten, ihren Intellekt zu nutzen, um sich so, Zitat, so gewissermaßen zu Herren und Eigentümer der Natur zu machen. Bacons für uns beunruhigende Beobachtung, dass die modernen Intellektuellen die Natur auf die Streckbank legen sollten, um sie zu zwingen, ihr Geheimnis mehr preiszugeben, ist hier ad rem. Sowohl Descartes als auch Bacon nehmen Karl Marx Vorweg, der in der berühmten 11. These über Feuerbach propagierte, Zitat, die Philosophen haben die Welt nur verschieden interpretiert, es kommt aber darauf an, sie zu verändern. Gewiss hat Marx den eher wissenschaftlichen Schwerpunkt seiner Vorgänger auf eine politische und wirtschaftliche Formel übertragen, aber der zentrale Punkt bleibt der gleiche. Das theoretische Denken dient allein der Zweckmäßigkeit. Im Gegensatz dazu möchte ich nun die Aufmerksamkeit auf einen anderen englischen Denker lenken, John Henry Newman. In seinem Buch Von Wesen der Universität, welches er anlässlich seiner Amtseinführung als Rektor der Katholischen Universität von Irland verfasste, schreibt Newman: Dieser Prozess der Übung, durch den der Intellekt statt für irgendeinen besonderen oder zufälligen Zweck geformt oder geopfert zu werden, für irgendeinen einzelnen Gewerbszweig oder Beruf, ein Studium oder eine Wissenschaft, seines selbst willen geschult wird, für die Erfassung seines im eigenen Gegenstandes und den Höhepunkt seiner eigentümlichen Bildung zu erreichen, wird freie Erziehung genannt. Weil in die Modernen hinein zu deren Entstehung Bacon und Descartes beigetragen haben und nachdem er einige ihrer dunklen Zeiten erlebt hatte, besinnt sich Newman bewusst auf ein älteres, klassischeres Verständnis von Wissen, das nicht auf die praktische Anwendung, sondern auf wahre Betrachtung ausgerichtet ist. Damit beruft er sich auf die Tradition der Philosophie im reinen Sinne des Wortes, nämlich auf die Liebe zur Weisheit um ihrer selbst willen. Die meisten Menschen im Westen wurden von Francis Bacon und seinen Epigonen so sehr beeinflusst, dass sie die Tradition der freien Künstler, auf die sich Newman beruft, inzwischen weitgehend aus den Augen verloren haben. Die von den modernen Denkern eröffnete pragmatische Denkweise ist so vorherrschend und ihre technologische Errungenschaften so nutzbringend geworden, dass die meisten unserer Mitmenschen wie verzaubert sind und sich keine andere Art des Denkens vorstellen können. Josef Pieper widmete einen großen Teil seiner intellektuellen Kraft der Revitalisierung von Newmans Vision, indem er die Grundlage der Geisteswissenschaften untersuchte, und zwar in dem, was er den philosophischen Akt nannte. In einer Vielzahl von Werken beschreibt er ihn als, Zitat, die Kraft eines wirklichen Beziehung zu haben, sich in Beziehung zu setzen zu einem Außen, oder die Fähigkeit zu einer auf die Totalität des Seins gerichteten Beziehungskraft. Um den naheliegendsten Einwand abzuwehren, dies impliziert nicht, jenes Objekt im Universum vor den Verstand zu führen, um es im Detail zu untersuchen. Es geht vielmehr darum zu erkennen, dass alles Existierende oder sogar möglicherweise Existierende etwas gemeinsam haben muss. Daher ist es in aristotelischen Begrifflichkeiten das Studium des Seienden, nicht unter irgendwelchen besonderen Bestimmungen, sondern exakt als Seiendes. Oder, um es in zeitgemäßeren Begriffen auszudrücken, es ist funktional äquivalent zu Heideggers Frage nach dem Sein. Und es führt zu der Frage, warum ist überhaupt etwas und nicht vielmehr nichts. Thomas von Aquin bezeugt dies, wenn er von der letztendlichen Ausrichtung des aktiven Intellekts auf die reinen Abstraktion des Esse spricht. Und Bernard Lonergan deutet es an, wenn er von dem Drängen des Geistes spricht, endlich alles über alles wissen zu wünschen. Nochmals, all dies hat nichts mit einem expliziten und kategorischen Begreifen jeder einzelnen Existenz zu tun, sondern vielmehr mit einem intuitiven Verstehen dessen, was jedes Existierende zu einem solchen werden lässt. Um diese Erkenntnisebene zu erreichen, so Pieper, ist eine Art von Bekehrung notwendig. Im Anbeginn der philosophischen Tradition hat Platon diesen Wandel als Entkommen aus der Höhle beschrieben. Wenn man die flackernden Schatten an der Höhlenwand als Gegenstände herkömmlicher, praktischer Wahrnehmung und die Form des Guten als das, was letztlich allen Dingen Sein verleiht, erkennt. Pieper beschreibt die Bekehrung nicht im Sinne einer Flucht, sondern im Sinne eines Durchbruchs von außen. Zitat: Philosophieren heißt zu erfahren, dass die von den unmittelbaren Lebenszwecken der bestimmten Nahumwelt des werktäglichen Lebens erschüttert zu werden mag, ja, erschüttert werden muss, durch den beunruhigenden Anruf der Welt, der totalen, die ewigen Wesensbilder der Dinge spiegelnden Wirklichkeit. Wie wunderbar ist dieser mindestens implizite Verweis auf Meister Eckharts Durchbruch und auf das, was der protestantische Philosoph Paul Tillich als Erschütterung und Hinwendung zum Unbedingten auszudrücken sucht. Es ist von höchster Wichtigkeit herauszustellen, dass philosophisches Fragen keine Abkehr von der Welt der gewöhnlichen Erfahrung bedeutet, sondern vielmehr das Erwachen eines echten Staunens über sie, dass sie danach strebt, das Sein der Dinge, ihr Essenz und ihr letzten Sinn zu erkennen, ist sie, wie Pieper sagt, Zitat, philosophieren im Erstaunen. Darum kann Thomas von Aquin sagen, dass der Dichter und der Philosoph in dem Maße verwandt sind, da beide, Zitat, es mit dem Erstaunlichen zu tun haben. Und warum der größte deutsche Dichter formulieren könnte, zum Erstaunen bin ich da. Gleichsam bezeugte James Joyce den erstaunlichen Durchbruch des Unbedingten in seiner berühmten Erzählung von Stephen Dedalus Begegnung mit der liebreisenden Frau an der Küste von Dublin. Nachdem er ihre Schönheit erblickt und ihre Erscheinung detailliert beschrieben hat, schrie der junge Mann, himmlischer Gott. Und in diesem Moment entdeckt er seine Berufung als Künstler, die er als Berichterstatter von Epiphanien erkennt. Stephen Dedalus entfloh nicht der Welt, um Erstaunen zu finden. Stattdessen sah er die Tiefdimension des gewöhnlichen Mädchens, das vor ihm in der Brandung stand. Pieper beharrt immer wieder darauf, dass diese wahrhaft kontemplative Schau nur möglich ist, wenn der Geist in der Gegenwart des Wirklichen rein rezeptiv wird, wenn das Subjekt seinen Willen und sein Selbstinteresse so hoch sieht und so lässt, dass sich das Wesen der Dinge manifestiert. In William Faulkners bedeutender Kurzgeschichte Der Bär will ein junger Mann, um die Jagd zu erlernen, die Gemeinschaft mit dem wilden und faszinierenden Tier, das ihn seit Jahren in seiner Fantasie verfolgt. Obgleich er darin trainiert wurde, bei seinem Streifzugen durch den Wald eine Kompass und ein Gewehr zu gebrauchen, wird ihm gesagt, dass er, wenn er den Bären sehen will, diese Beiseiten lassen und sich dem Willen und den Vorrechten des Tieres unterwerfen muss. Faulkner verwendet hier die Sprache der mystischen Tradition, wenn er den Moment beschreibt, in dem sich der Bär dem Jungen als keine Kraft zeigt, die sowohl tremendum und faszinans ist und dann aber wieder in den Schatten des Waldes abtaucht. Wieder einmal offenbart das Gewöhnliche seine Tiefe, wenn das aggressive Subjekt sich hingibt und eine demütig kontemplative Haltung einnimmt. Wenn ich mich noch einmal auf den größten deutschen Schriftsteller berufen darf, so hat Goethe seine wissenschaftliche Methode der von Newton gegenübergestellt, wobei er die letztere als aggressiv und die seine als ehrfürchtig gegenüber dem, was sie zu erkennen sucht, ansah. Nicht so sehr auf das Praktische als auf das Erstaunliche ausgerichtet. Ein letztes Beispiel, das Piepers Ansatz vielleicht am ehesten trifft. Jacques Maritain vertrat die Ansicht, dass eine Intuition des Seins die Voraussetzung für jedes wirkliche philosophische Denken ist. In seinem Fall geschah der Durchbruch, als er einen gewöhnlichen Obstgarten betrachtete, in dem die Bäume ihr Sein flüsterten. A good place to change to English, I think. You're very kind. You're very kind. Thank you. These reflections of Josef Pieper are remarkably consonant with the central theme of Iris Murdoch's philosophical work. Impatient with the dominant Kantianism of her own formation in moral philosophy, Murdoch endeavored to reintroduce into the conversation elements of Plato's metaphysics and ethics, most particularly his notion of the good. In her seminal essay, The Sovereignty of Good Over Other Concepts, Murdoch draws attention to the unselfing that occurs in any real experience of the good or the beautiful. She invites her reader to consider an anxious man gazing out the window, here's her quote, brooding perhaps on some damage to his prestige. Presently, a hovering kestrel, it's a kind of small falcon, catches his eye. I'm quoting again. In a moment, she writes, everything is altered. The brooding self with its hurt vanity has disappeared. There's nothing now but kestrel. And when he returns to thinking of the other matter, it somehow seems less important. The point, of course, is that the beautiful bird has relativized the self, prompting a radical reorientation, whereby the ego is no longer the center of psychological operations. Accordingly, the good, I'm quoting again, both in its genesis and its enjoyment, is a thing totally opposed to selfish obsession. It invigorates our best faculties, and to use Platonic language, it inspires love in the highest part of the soul, close quote. Here we see the Pieper element. The good prompts a shift from an aggressive to a receptive mode of consciousness. It interrupts the gravitational pull of the ego. Hence, in Murdoch's language, I'm quoting again, goodness is connected with the attempt to see the unself, to see and to respond to the real world in light of a virtuous consciousness, close quote. We see something very similar in regard to truth, especially if we distinguish truth carefully from information. The latter, so prized by the denizens of social media, is detachable from the event or experience that gave rise to it. Information is always about something. In David Schindler's words, I'm quoting, it indicates relation or reference from a distance. And from this we can derive another principal characteristic of information, namely transferability. Precisely because data of information are detachable from the reality that produced them, they can be transported effortlessly across enormous distances to various devices, where they become available to numberless others, literally at your fingertips. As they become increasingly detached from reality, data of information become increasingly manipulable, subject to the whim of those who share them and comment on them. But all this must be sharply contrasted with authentic knowledge, which the Bible suggests in its peculiar usage carries a sense of unsurpassed intimacy. So I do not know a man, says the Virgin Mary to the angel. Compare gathering information on a website concerning the 1968 Olympic Games in Mexico City with actually attending those games. Or set side by side reading a Wikipedia article about a famous politician and actually sharing a dinner conversation with him. Internet data could be propagated to millions and remain almost completely under the control of the one who sends them. But the direct experiences defy any such attempts at manipulation. The former are, as I said, quite literally at our fingertips, but the latter become present only in gift form and to the one who is receptive to them. In Pieper's language, real truth becomes available only to a contemplative consciousness. Though Teilhard de Chardin, whom Pieper often cites favorably, dreamed of a noosphere, which would functionally connect everyone on the planet to everyone else, and though the internet is frequently celebrated as corresponding to this Teilhardian rêve, I wonder if anyone really thinks that Teilhard or Pieper would be content with the kind of consciousness mediated by the internet. Does anyone think the users of social media are engaging in real contemplation, or that bits of information they're sharing lead to the intuition into the being of things? I rather doubt it. Second section now is the connection to God. So that's very important for Pieper. I think the philosophical act is going to open you to a consideration of God. Everything discussed to this point revolves around Pieper's understanding of contemplation and the philosophical act. But basic to his thought is that philosophy leads ineluctably to a consideration of God. This is the case because philosophy makes us aware of the being of things, and it discloses the fact that the being of things in the world exists in a contingent or conditioned form. And this conduces to the question of what ultimately causes that form of worldliness to be. In a word, the question, why is there something rather than nothing, the question that characterizes philosophical consciousness as such, expects an answer. If being gives itself to the contemplative gaze, who precisely gives it? Heidegger asked the question that way a number of times. Now, Pieper broaches these questions in a number of his works, but nowhere more pointedly than in my favorite of his books, The Silence of St. Thomas. Like G.K. Chesterton, Pieper opines that the best descriptor of the common doctor would be Thomas of the Creator, since the notion of creation runs as a leitmotif through almost the whole of his oeuvre. Thomas takes as axiomatic the claim that everything that exists apart from God is created by God. But this means that everything in the world has been brought into being through an act of intelligence. Things are never dumbly there, they're intelligibly there. Pieper observes that Aquinas would agree with the Kantian idea that truth belongs not to what is but what is thought, but with the extremely important proviso that it's essential to all worldly things that they are thought precisely by God. They are real because they are thought, is how Pieper puts it. Here the divine knowing, which is prevenient and creative, is the reverse of our knowing, which tends to be passive and derivative. In a curious way, this brings St. Thomas close to Jean-Paul Sartre, who argued that the nature of things, essence, follows from the thought of a creative subject, existence. What Sartre did not see, or at least wouldn't accept, is that God is the supreme subject who determines the objectivity of truth in things. It's only in this context that we can really understand the Thomistic formula that truth is the adequatio rei et intellectus. A standard misunderstanding construes this adequatio as the forming of a mental picture that correctly imitates what exists out in the world, so that truth exists primarily or even exclusively in here, in the mind. But if we take adequatio to imply something like adjusting or equalizing, we appreciate that there must be an intelligibility already existing in things that makes truth in the mind possible. Thomas means that the intelligible form of a person, a thing, or a state of affairs is the objective truth that summons an inquiring mind, an intelligibility born of an infinite mind that seeks correspondence with a finite intelligence. In 1960, the theoretical physicist Eugene Wigner published a seminal paper with the intriguing title, The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Physical Sciences. Though not a religious man, Wigner found miraculous, that's his word, the fact that physical reality can be described only through recourse to the most complex forms of mathematics. Why, he wondered, should the world be marked by such densely textured intelligibility? Though Wigner did not draw the obvious conclusion, Josef Ratzinger did. In his Introduction to Christianity, Ratzinger argues that the only finely reasonable explanation for the universal intelligibility, which is assumed by any scientist, is that a great subjective intelligence has thought it into being. The English word recognize alludes to this relationship, for it suggests that whatever we know is re-thought, it's recognized, thought in response to an antecedent act of intellection. Pieper states the principle with admirable laconicism. I'm quoting Pieper here. Things are knowable because they've been created. That's a master idea in Pieper, I think, that has all kinds of implications. Now, it's only against this rather loamy background that we can understand the silence of St. Thomas. Pieper, of course, took his cue from the silence into which Thomas famously fell after the mysterious experience of December 6th, 1273, when he said, "All I've written is straw compared to what's been revealed to me." But Pieper shows that something like silence conditions all of Aquinas' metaphysical thought. What follows from the intelligibility of all things is paradoxically their incomprehensibility. For the deepest truth of things corresponds not to our understanding of them, but to God's. But this divine comprehension includes a context and purpose that we cannot even in principle grasp. Hence, their knowability, I'm quoting Pieper again, cannot be wholly exhausted by any finite intellect, since the very element which makes them capable of being known must necessarily be at the same time the reason why they are so unfathomable. That, I think, is a wonderful, almost Chestertonian sort of paradox, but key to Pieper. Precisely because God knows things into being, their existence is inevitably open-ended. For, I'm quoting again, what is real is called true insofar as it realizes that toward which it is ordained by the mind of God. Close quote. That's from Pieper. We recall that for Aquinas, God's providence is nothing other than a ratio in the intellect of God that's inherent in all the finite things that God governs. But only fragments of that ratio can be comprehended by our created minds. And this obtains at the moral level, which is the import of the book of Job, for instance, but also at the scientific and metaphysical level, which helps to explain Aquinas' puzzling observation in his presentation on the Apostles' Creed, to the effect, and I'm quoting here from Aquinas himself, the quest for knowledge has not succeeded in finding the essence of a single fly. I know that sounds like some kind of epistemological nihilism, but it's precisely this point, that even the fly has an essence that we can't possibly grasp because God has thought it into being. Since all things have what Pieper calls an eternal name, it's lovely, that's unavailable to us, I'm quoting him now, they possess these two properties. On the one hand, their ontological clarity and self-revelation, and on the other hand, their inexhaustibility. This obviously has nothing to do, as I say, with modern skepticism, but with a mystical perception of the limits of the human mind. A careful reading of this more obscure corner of Thomas's epistemology serves to hold off the charge of rationalism often hurled at the scholastics. What the greatest scholastic in fact holds is what Pieper characterizes as, lovely, an epistemology of hope, according to which the knowing subject is a traveler, is a viator, necessarily someone on the way and never at his ultimate destination. Following both Aristotle and St. Thomas here, Pieper proposes that we, at least in this life, are, quote, like bats dazzled by the sunlight. Once more, the question after being, die Frage nach dem Sein, can be entertained properly only in reference to God, the intelligence that gives rise to a finally incomprehensible intelligibility. Now, the third point. Leisure and festivity, the part of Pieper that's best known, at least in the English-speaking world, I'd say. So certainly in the English-speaking ambit, the best known of Pieper's books is Leisure, the Basis of Culture. But I don't think it's possible to understand the central argument of that book without taking into consideration all the foregoing. Culture is, for Pieper, largely a function of engaging in the philosophical act, and that act is possible only within a context of leisure, which is to say, an ambiance where the workaday has been at least provisionally set aside. He points out the term for leisure in Greek is skole, from which the Latin schola and English school are derived. The implication is that what takes place in the cultured space of the school or the academy is something fundamentally different from what occurs in the marketplace or the political arena. In the latter, practicality holds sway, but in the former, a type of play is given pride of place. With what does one fill one's leisure time? Pieper's great answer is celebration, in which three essential elements come into focus, namely, I'm quoting him here, relaxation, effortlessness, and the superiority of active leisure to all functions, close quote. We've seen some of this already. Contemplation involves a setting aside of intellectual aggression, the adoption of an attitude of receptivity. What's too often overlooked in Leisure, the Basis of Culture, is the next step that Pieper makes in the direction of worship. If celebration is, I'm quoting him again, man's affirmation of the universe and his experiencing the world in an aspect other than its everyday one, close quote, there's no more intense mode of celebration than the praise of God, the one responsible for the being of the world. This is why, Pieper points out, Plato's Academy had its deepest roots in ancient Greek religion. Indeed, one member of the Academy was always called upon to perform a sacrifice as the day began. And Socrates himself spoke openly and often of the daimon that inspired him. So Pieper observes, I'm quoting again, culture lives on religion through divine worship. And when culture itself is endangered and leisure is called into question, there's only one thing to be done. Go back to the first and original source, close quote. In the Israelite context, the day of leisure par excellence, the Sabbath, was a day when sacrifice took place in the temple, signaling an overcoming of merely pragmatic calculation and economic exchange in favor of a kind of waste, a sort of deliberate squandering, the performance of an utterly useless act. In light of the above, we can understand why Pieper placed the following quote from Plato on the frontispiece of Leisure, the Basis of Culture. It's worth quoting now in its fullness. But the gods, taking pity on mankind born to work, laid down a succession of recurring feasts to restore them from their fatigue. And he gave them the Muses and Apollo their leader and Dionysus as companions in their feasts, so that nourishing themselves in festive companionship with the gods, they should again stand upright and erect. That's leisure and culture and worship coming together. In appreciating the tight connection between culture and cult, of course, Pieper was making common cause with Christopher Dawson, the great historian who saw a threat to one as necessarily a threat to the other. In his text, In Tune with the World, A Theory of Festivity, it's a lovely little book, Pieper expands upon these notions. He opines there's a link between authentic festivity and the visio beatifica, since both involve, I'm quoting, a seeing that confers bliss, an awareness of the divine ground of the universe. In this context, Pieper again favorably cites Teilhard de Chardin's peculiar statement that the whole of the evolution of the cosmos aims at the elaboration of ever more perfect eyes. It's curious, but celebration is tied, therefore, to the contemplation we've been describing, by which the soul turns to its infinite object, and this is Pieper again, becomes aware of the illimitable horizon of reality as a whole. To attain this, a sacrifice of time is necessary, a setting aside of a day or a week for impracticality. What follows from festivity, Pieper argues, is a joy born of love. And I love this quote from him. Joy is the response of the lover receiving what he loves. It's beautiful. In this case, coming to know the being of things and its source. Hence, he cites John Chrysostom, ubi caritas gaudet, ibi est festivitas. Right? Where love rejoices, there is festivity. As such, festivity, though perhaps prompted by a particular event in history, involves, I'm quoting again, an absolutely universal affirmation extending to the world as a whole. It's conditioned by the conviction that everything that exists is good. Here, curiously, the book of Genesis and Friedrich Nietzsche come together. On the primordial day of festivity, the original Sabbath, God himself saw that everything he made is good, and the ensemble very good. Nietzsche, this is Pieper, in a similar vein stated, if it be granted that we say yea to a single moment, then in so doing we've said yea, not only to ourselves, but to all existence. That's Nietzsche, but it's exactly the point Pieper's making, I think. This is why there's no sadder state of affairs than the refusal to celebrate. And I'm quoting Pieper again, there can be no deadlier, more ruthless destruction of festivity than refusal of ritual praise. It's arguably the central motif of the Old Testament, that the basic source of human misery is a suspension of right praise, of orthodoxy in the literal sense. Practically without exception, trouble comes to Israel as a result of running after false gods, engaging in the worship of something that's other than the Creator. We might say, therefore, that a phony festivity, a false worship, is the clearest indicator of cultural decadence. And don't we see this, Pieper suggests, in the ersatz and secularized forms of celebration that emerged out of the French Revolution, and that have in some form continued to the present day. How pathetic, he says, the French revolutionaries had to command festivity. Quote, "The populace will fill the streets and public squares." Something's gone seriously wrong when you're doing that. Such politically motivated celebration has nothing to do with the gratitude that springs naturally from a perception of the goodness of all being. Pieper summarizes as follows, quote, "There can be no festivity when man, imagining himself self-sufficient, refuses to recognize that goodness of things which goes beyond any conceivable utility. It is the goodness of reality taken as a whole, which validates all particular goods and which man himself could never produce." Pieper perceptively observes that the communist designation of May 1st as a day of voluntary work is the full expression of perverted festivity. Just couple more pages. Gathering these fragments now. So by way of conclusion, I want to tease out at least some implication from these three Pieper themes for our contemporary culture. First, it's imperative that we recover the sublimity and uniqueness of the philosophical act. Does anyone doubt that in the West at least, an ideological secularism and materialism hold sway, and that people are therefore locked within the musty confines? He's been quoted now a number of times, what my predecessor as Pieper Prize winner, Charles Taylor, called the buffered self. If reality is simply identified with matter and energy, then there's no rational path beyond the physical sciences, and hence the philosophical act is never undertaken. The upshot is that the liberal arts are effectively stripped of their significance, and Francis Bacon's practicality has utterly triumphed over John Henry Newman's invigorating uselessness. One way to recover the legitimacy of the philosophical act, I think, is to show the absurdity and inner incoherence of ideological materialism. For materialist scientism is a philosophical intuition and by no means the result of scientific experimentation. Hence, it is like logical positivism, self-refuting. For one cannot, on the basis of a philosophical perception, deny the legitimacy of philosophy. Another path is to show, as we hinted above, that theoretical physics, to give just one example, cannot be undertaken in abstraction from mathematics, and hence from the properly invisible. But once you've shown that reality encompasses both the visible and the invisible, the question after being ineluctably reasserts itself. But generally speaking, I wonder whether something like the spiritual exercise proposed by Iris Murdoch might not be the best way to break through the buffered self. For the experience of the good and the beautiful compels a letting go of the aggressive and self-centered reason and opens the door to real contemplation. We need teachers capable of facilitating this conversion from mere utility. This makes Pieper, I think, a prophet for our time. Second, the consideration of God in our culture by both believers and non-believers is sadly conditioned by the problem just explored. I mean that God, whether believed in or not, is typically construed as a supreme being, one existent among many. Hence, people look for him and make judgments about his existence using a practical form of reasoning geared toward the things in the world. But this is precisely the wrong way to explore the question of why there's something rather than nothing. One way to overcome this tendency is to recover Aquinas' great teaching that God is not a being, does not belong even to the genus of being, but is rather ipsum esse, the subsistent act of to be itself, which neither exists alongside of finite beings nor competes with them metaphysically. Once the idea of God is sufficiently clarified, it's easier to see how a consideration of God follows readily from the philosophical act. Finally, we must recover festivity, but precisely within a religious context. For some years now, I've been tracking the numbers on disaffiliation from the churches, especially in my country, but also in the West generally. As you know, they've tended to be dispiriting. Many reasons are given: a deeply unintelligent catechesis, the dumbed-down faith, the conviction that religion and science are at odds, there's a category error, the sexual abuse scandals, our fault, etc. But it should be obvious to anyone that the abandonment of the liturgy, of formal religious ritual, has had massively deleterious consequences in Western society. Coupled with the musings of the new atheists, the hollowing out of the religious space has produced the spiking numbers we see in suicidal ideation, severe depression, anxiety, especially among the young. And why would we find this puzzling? If people are convinced they've come from nowhere, there are no objective moral values, human nature is utterly fluid, death is tantamount to annihilation, why are we surprised that a general malaise marks the spirit of the West? And if our festivity is divorced from ritualized expression of gratitude to God and has devolved into celebration of nature or politics, then we'll live, spiritually speaking, on blasted ground. Therefore, along with the exercises that foster the philosophical act and a more correct understanding of the nature of God, perhaps the most important thing we could do is to reclaim the mantle of the Hebrew prophets and the mantle, I would say, of Josef Pieper, and summon our people back to right praise and away from the false gods. Thank you, everybody.